The original Metroid released first in Japan on the Famicom Disk System in 1986, and then on the NES in America in 1987. And it was basically a side-scrolling science fiction take on Legend of Zelda. Both games presented players with a large map filled with tons of secrets, but while the bulk of Zelda's game took place in the various dungeons scattered across the overworld, Metroid was essentially a single expansive dungeon. Although the bulk of Metroid's map was available for exploration right from the start, much of the world was out of reach until you had discovered the appropriate upgrade to bypass whatever threshold blocked your progress, such as the Morph Ball to roll through low passages, missiles to break through specific doors, bombs to destroy certain blocks, and high jump boots to reach previously inaccessible areas. This formula of non-linear, exploration-based gameplay and the steady acquisition of tools and upgrades as a means to access more and more of an ever-expanding world map would prove to be so unique that Metroid would pioneer its own subgenre. Today there's no shortage of games that could be described as Metroid-like, so many that the term Metroidvania has now become an accepted label for these types of games. Despite the fact that it was originally used specifically to differentiate Metroid-inspired Castlevania games like Symphony of the Night from the classic-style games in the series, Metroidvania has become such a detached catch-all term that even Metroid and its various sequels are themselves often called Metroidvania games. Although I had some experience with the original Metroid when I was a kid, Metroid 2: Return of Samus was the first game in the series I actually completed. And in fact, it was the only Metroid game I owned until Metroid Fusion came out on the Game Boy Advance in 2002. And it's definitely the launching off point for Metroid becoming one of my favorite game franchises of all time. Despite being the namesake of the entire series, the Metroids themselves are actually seen very little in any of the games. They generally only appear as late game enemies, and often only used as plot devices to establish or simply punch up the narrative of whatever game they appear in. Metroid 2, on the other hand, is the only game in the series that is predominantly about Metroids. The entire premise of the game is that esteemed space hunter Samus Aran, or Samus Aran if you prefer, has been sent by the Galactic Federation to planet SR-388, which is believed to be the homeworld of the Metroid species, with a specific order to destroy every Metroid on the planet, which is conveniently only 39 individual creatures. You have a little kill counter right here on the bottom of the screen. Early on in the game, we discovered that the jellyfish-like creatures we recognize as Metroids are simply the first form of a multi-stage life cycle. You'll encounter progressively evolved Metroid forms as you get deeper into the game, which become increasingly more xenomorph-like in their design. This culminates in a battle with the Metroid Queen, likely influenced by the climax of Aliens. Now, despite lacking color, the graphics in this game look great, especially Samus's new and improved character design, which, showing some impressive attention to detail, has unique left and right facing sprites, so her arm cannon is always clearly on her right arm. Metroid 2 is also responsible for canonizing the look of Samus herself. In the original game, Samus's suit upgrades were designated by simple palette changes, which for obvious reasons wasn't really an option on the Game Boy. So in Metroid 2, collecting the Varia suit upgrade visibly changes Samus's appearance, most notably by giving her the large, spherical pauldrons that are now tied intrinsically to the character. In other words, some of the most distinctive aspects of Samus's design were created in Metroid 2 as a direct response to the limitations of the Game Boy hardware. Metroid 2 also makes a few alterations and improvements to the original game's format that would become standard for every game that would follow. It was the first game in the series to use dedicated save points, a significant upgrade from the cumbersome passwords used by the original game. Metroid 2 also introduced the Spring Ball, which allows you to jump in Morph Ball form, as well as the Space Jump, which lets you jump continuously and essentially fly around the map. Then there's the Spider Ball, an upgrade to the Morph Ball that lets you climb on every surface in the game that isn't covered in spikes. This is an incredibly useful item that is utilized heavily throughout the game, but it hasn't had as much of a lasting impact in the series as Metroid 2's other upgrades, as the only other games it appeared in have been the Metroid Prime series. Metroid 2 concludes with a moment that gives Samus her first glimpse of character development, and would also establish the narrative events that would be continued in the subsequent games. After defeating the Metroid Queen, Samus discovers a single surviving Metroid hatchling. Even though it was her mission to completely destroy the Metroid species, Samus spares the hatchling's life, and it appears to bond with her as its mother. It follows her back to her ship, helpfully clearing out obstructions to allow them to escape the planet together. Despite appearing on technically inferior hardware, Metroid 2, outwardly at least, seems to be technically superior to the original game. Now to be fair, the original Metroid was an extremely early release for the NES. A Game Boy game from 1991 didn't have to work too hard to appear more advanced than an NES game that was about half a decade old at that point. Under the hood, however, Metroid 2 was honestly an extremely watered-down experience compared to the original game, and it has a few issues that have kept it from aging as well as the two games that bookended it. For starters, Metroid 2 is a very linear game. Your progression through most of the game relies not so much on which power-ups you've collected, but rather by how many Metroids you've killed. The entirety of the game is a descent through a mostly vertical cavern, which is partitioned off into a handful of distinct areas by a pool of caustic liquid that drains once you've defeated all the Metroids in the surrounding areas. There's still a fair amount of exploration required as you poke around for items and enemies on either side of the flooded areas, but there's never really a reason to backtrack to areas from earlier in the game, which unfortunately means that the defining aspect of the series, i.e. returning to previously explored areas with the correct tool or ability to open up a new path, isn't really present in Metroid 2. Another common complaint with Metroid 2 was how enormous Samus appears on the Game Boy screen. Now, simply copying her NES sprite pixel for pixel would have effectively doubled how large she appeared on the Game Boy screen. But Samus's new and improved Game Boy sprite is considerably larger than her original NES sprite, exaggerating her size even further. Granted, the majority of the game is crafted thoughtfully enough that I personally don't think this is too much of a problem. There are plenty of narrow passages and tunnels that feel oppressively tight and claustrophobic, but this feels almost intentional, adding to the foreboding tone of the game, that Samus is a solitary interloper in a hostile alien environment. However, the cramped, zoomed-in perspective sometimes makes exploration a little more difficult than it probably should be, especially in the game's many large, open areas. It's kinda hard to build up a mental map of the world when you're seeing so little of it at a time, exacerbated by the fact that the same basic tile sets are used throughout the majority of the game. With no color to distinguish one area from the next, many of the areas start feeling a little samey. Now to be clear, even though I think these are valid complaints, they aren't my complaints, or at least they've never really detracted from my overall enjoyment of the game. Overall, Metroid 2 is an excellent game, an impressively huge and satisfying adventure that noticeably stands out in a library of games that often feel like lesser, bite-sized alternatives to their console counterparts. It may not hold up as well as the two games on either side of its release, but it has continued to live on in the hearts of its fans. When the original Metroid received a full remake in 2004 with Metroid Zero Mission on the Game Boy Advance, anticipation began building for Metroid 2 to receive a similar treatment. However, as the years went by with no such game coming directly from Nintendo, a number of fan-developed games began to circulate around the internet. So many, in fact, that the most famous of these was called Another Metroid 2 Remake, or AM2R. Now, as far as I know, AM2R is the only unofficial Metroid 2 remake to have actually been completed, which is just as well since Nintendo slapped a DMCA notice on the project in 2016 and completely shut it down. Although Nintendo was well within their rights to do this didn't exactly sit well with the community of Metroid fans who had felt largely ignored and unseen by Nintendo for so long. At this point, the last game in the Metroid series had been 2010's Metroid Other M, which, depending on who you talk to, was either a flawed but overhated game or an unmitigated disaster.
The baby, the baby, the baby, the baby, baby, the baby, the baby, the baby, the baby.
Regardless of how you feel about Other M, it was clearly not the game that fans wanted, and it effectively killed the series for over half a decade. It seems almost poetic then that Nintendo would use Metroid 2 to give the series a soft relaunch in 2017 with Metroid Samus Returns for the 3DS. Samus Returns was a full remake of Metroid 2, which, if nothing else, gave a bit more validity to why Nintendo had shut down AM2R the year before. Metroid 2 is probably the least Metroid-like of any of the games in the series, but its importance should not be denied. It may not have evolved the series with the same great strides that Super Metroid did, but it did introduce many mechanics and ideas that have become standard for the entire series. More importantly, it was this game that established the overarching lore of the Metroid series. And it was this game that established not only the physical design, but the actual character of Samus Aran. Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters released on the Game Boy in November of 1991, around the same time as the release of Metroid 2. Now, the Metroid and Kid Icarus series have long since been linked together, with many considering Kid Icarus to be something of a sister series to Metroid. Both games were developed more or less back-to-back for the Famicom Disk System by Nintendo's R&D1 team, and they both released in the US in 1987 as the two lone entries to Nintendo's Silver Box Adventure series. The similarities in how the two games played was also a bit uncanny, as both featured similar movement and shooting physics, and vertical platforming was a prominent focus in both games. Further solidifying the connection between the two series is the Komodo enemy that appears in the final stages of Kid Icarus, which is, well, that's a Metroid. The manual even hints at this by suggesting that this enemy came from someplace other than Earth. And finally, both series have also been historically underrepresented by Nintendo, with Kid Icarus in particular being the more overlooked of the two. Now, I've always had something of a soft spot for the original Kid Icarus. I think its weirdness is endearing. I think Pit is a great character. And of course, the soundtrack is absolutely phenomenal. I can admit that it's an extremely flawed game, however. Much of the game has you ascending through enormous vertical levels, and the screen only scrolls one way, so you're essentially creating an endless bottomless pit beneath you as you climb. Ducking will cause you to drop through certain platforms, which doesn't really have many beneficial applications in the game. It's basically just one more way the game gives you to fall to your death. Kid Icarus also has a number of mysterious mechanics that aren't explained very well at all. Every now and then you'll be given an upgrade that increases the strength of your arrows, but you have to fulfill certain conditions to receive this upgrade. Even the manual is pretty cagey about what these conditions are. It implies that it has something to do with killing a certain number of enemies, possibly avoiding taking damage, entering chambers, or maybe not entering chambers, and having enough items, or possibly not too many. Kid Icarus is also somewhat infamous for its inverted difficulty scale. Now, to be clear, the game itself, by which I mean the layout of the stages and the strengths of the enemies, doesn't ever really increase in difficulty. Those platforming levels at the end aren't really any harder than the ones at the beginning. But another way to say that is that the very first stage in the game is just as difficult as the final stage. Over the course of the game, you'll eventually start increasing your life bar. You'll earn secondary power-up items like fire arrows or a shield from training rooms. And odds are pretty good that you'll at least accidentally meet whatever conditions are necessary for the arrow upgrades. But in those first 2 or 3 stages, your life bar is at its lowest level and your arrows are at their weakest, and you probably haven't earned enough hearts to buy helpful items like health refills, which means that you probably won't be able to survive the training rooms to earn the secondary power-ups. And even if you do, your health bar will be too small to even activate them, as they each require a longer health bar than you'll realistically have in those first few stages. In short, Kid Icarus throws you into the deep end right at the outset, and surviving long enough to where the game stops being unfair and frustrating takes a degree of patience and/or stubbornness that is probably beyond most people, especially when the NES has no shortage of games that are far more friendly and rewarding to new players. Even after playing through this game dozens of times, I still can't tell you exactly how the experience system works. But if you spend a bit of time farming enemies for hearts and points in the first stage, you'll be well on your way to having a much easier time with the game. I understand it's got its flaws, but I think Kid Icarus is a great game, and it's definitely worth a look if you're at all interested in retro games. Of Myths and Monsters isn't so much a sequel to the NES game as it was just another event that happens in the Kid Icarus universe, totally independent from the events from the previous game. A Kid Icarus Gaiden, if you will. It's also so similar to the first game that it might as well have been a port. Just like the original Kid Icarus, Of Myths and Monsters is separated into 3 worlds. Each world is divided into 3 platforming stages followed by a dungeon. You collect hearts by destroying enemies to purchase items from shops, and you tally up your points at the end of each stage and upgrade your life bar when you reach certain score thresholds. You'll encounter training rooms where you can earn secondary power-up items like fire arrows or a shield, and if you fulfill certain unspoken objectives, you'll be granted upgrades for your arrow to increase the strength of your shots. Unlike Metroid 2, Of Myths and Monsters doesn't attempt to evolve or innovate on its predecessor. However, it addresses almost every flaw from the original game. The biggest change is that the screen scrolls up and down, removing what is probably the main cause of death from the original game. The feather item still appears in the game, but since there's no longer any pits to fall into, it now enables you to fly freely around the screen for a few moments. Even without the feather, you can flap Pit's wings by tapping the jump button, slowing your descent and allowing you to cover longer distances with a jump. There's still the harp that turns enemies into hammers, but now you can use these hammers outside the dungeons, breaking open statues to find health refills or hidden chambers. The secondary power-ups still require your life bar to be filled to certain points to be activated, but now you can even use these power-ups in the dungeons, which you weren't able to do in the original game. There are hint rooms that explain how certain mechanics work, or direct you to secret areas. There are also many more chambers scattered around the stages, which means more opportunities to buy items and receive upgrades and power-ups. You can also save your progress after each stage, eliminating the need for those ridiculous passwords. In short, Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters is pretty much the exact same game as the original, except with almost all the frustrating aspects stripped out of the game. And yet something else is missing from it too, something I can't quite put my finger on. Maybe it's the lack of connective tissue to the previous game. Other than a handful of characters like the Reaper and the Eggplant Wizard, almost every enemy in the game is unique to Of Myths and Monsters. I use the word unique very loosely here because the enemies in Kid Icarus all have an analog here in Of Myths and Monsters, but without the weirdness and charm. Memorable creatures like the Mono Eyes or the Mix are replaced by floating skulls and giant grasshoppers. The enemy layers that were filled with the bizarre Specknose enemy are now inhabited by plain old bats. Even the Metroid-like Kameto enemy has been replaced by a simpler, less interesting floating blob. Or maybe what's missing is Hirokazu Tanaka's music, none of which is used in this game. The soundtrack to this game certainly isn't bad, but it definitely falls short of the themes from the original game. The music also stops and resets every time you enter a door, and there are so many doors in this game, especially in the overworld, that you'll likely never hear more than the first few seconds of the stage theme before you reach the next chamber. But as strange as it is to say, I think what's actually missing is the clunkiness and frustration from the original game. When all the rough edges have been smoothed over, and the game spoils you with opportunities to refill your health and power yourself up, when you're never in any danger of seeing a game over screen, what's left is a short and trivial experience, lacking in any real sense of accomplishment for actually beating the game. That's how it was for me anyway. I don't like being frustrated, but I also don't like it when a game puts up no resistance at all. In the process of whitewashing over the worst aspects from the original game, Of Myths and Monsters, deliberately or not, fails to reproduce its predecessor's best aspects, like its assortment of charmingly bizarre enemy characters, its awesome soundtrack, and yes, even its challenge. Of Myths and Monsters feels like a competent Kid Icarus knockoff, a bootleg sequel that somehow got the blessing to use the name and main character from the original game. And that might be exactly how Nintendo themselves see it. While Metroid 2 was developed in-house by Nintendo with many of the same team members who had worked on the original game, I don't believe this is true for Kid Icarus's Game Boy sequel. Now, since the game has no end credits, there's no way to know for certain, but it's believed that Of Myths and Monsters was at least in part developed by Toze, who have basically made a career of being an uncredited shadow developer for hundreds of games over the years. Kid Icarus Uprising, the third and final game in the Kid Icarus series, released on the 3DS in 2012. Uprising was as much a sequel as it was a gushing love letter to the original game, and it made no mention to any character or story element from the Game Boy game. Curiously, Of Myths and Monsters was only released in Western territories. It didn't actually appear in Japan until it was released on the 3DS's Virtual Console in 2012, likely only as a supplemental method for generating hype for Uprising. I think it goes without saying that Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters was not exactly my cup of tea. It's not a bad game, but I do think it's inferior to the NES original. However, I fully expect that I'd be in the minority in that regard, so as always, whether I like a game or not, I still recommend playing it yourself. And as it happens, Nintendo just released this game for the online Game Boy library, so now's a good opportunity to give it a shot.